1 2 minutes. Got it.
Okay. Got it.
Close it. Put it up here.
Okay, here we go. Good evening, ladies. Good everyone on board. We are about to get started. It's our 3-step program again, and it's 8:30 on Monday. We are going to be learning about this week's Parsha with a main focus, how we can extrapolate, we can discover Parsha messages that can work for us, the way we live our lives, and to upgrade it a drop so that we could be better positioned to be doing what Hashem wants us to do. What does Hashem want us to do? To use every moment of every bit of life with all the challenges that come with it to somehow be excited about serving Hashem day in, day out. This is what we're looking forward to, and this is what we're going to try and do today by looking into the Parsha, be able to find exactly that. So we are starting off with, let's just get this over here. I got the wrong slide up. Helps get the right one on. The computer's feeling tired. We're going to start off while it's loading. We're going to start off with what's going on this week in the calendar. So it's not an enormous amount going on in the calendar this week. We're going to go backwards. Here we go. Why do I say there's not an enormous amount going on in the calendar? Because it's more or less a go-to regular week. What do we say regular week? We say a regular week can consist of, we're talking about, we had in this past Shabbos, although we're learning Pirkei Avos, we started a new cycle. On the next Shabbos, we're going to do another new cycle. We're back on track with Parshas Nosai, back into Bahalosecha, although in Eretz Yisrael, they're running a different Parsha track. There's one little highlight, I know it's not a little. There's one highlight which is worth mentioning, and that relates to yesterday's calendar date. It's a big date on the Chabad calendar, recent Chabad calendar, because it has with it a lot of message. Yesterday was the day, the anniversary of when the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe's father-in-law, Rebbe Yossi Yitzchak Schneerson, who was the leader of Chabad Hasidism during the time of when communism first launched in Russia. It was in the time of the revolution and just after, and the Frierdiker Rebbe was challenged to be able to somehow figure out ways, and often at great risk, to keep Yiddishkeit alive, which eventually became behind the Iron Curtain. And it wasn't a small mission. It was extremely complicated, very dangerous, costed a fortune in money, a fortune in human efforts and lives, but the results are enormous. Until this very day, we see how much Yiddishkeit managed to survive in a place that was starved from its flow of Yiddishkeit. So what was the anniversary yesterday? In Tov Reish Pei Zayin in 1927, the Rebbe was on a major push. It was just 7 years into the mission, and the efforts were getting stronger, but so was the pressure. Left, right, and center, they were trying to track down and figure out how was it that this Yiddishkeit movement was still growing and still pushing. And all the pointers and and then it was the NKVD, the GPU, the four precursors to the KGB, were pointing their fingers at the Frierdiker Rebbe. And they spent a lot of time gathering information that would be a file that would be leveled against the Frierdiker Rebbe once they had arrested him. And in Tov Reish Pei Zayin, 1927, on the 15th of Sivan, which was a short while after some of the major Farbrengens that the Frierdiker Rebbe had openly and clearly encouraged Hasidim to not buckle down, to not slow down, to keep on doing what they're doing, especially highlighting some of the dry law that wasn't necessarily being adhered to by the rank and file and by the lower class government, but it was within the permittance of the Russian law at the time, even communist rule, to allow a lot of the mitzvahs to continue. And the Frierdiker Rebbe was pushing people not to go with the flow, but instead to do certainly that which was rightfully theirs, but even more than that, to not allow their children or their families to be dragged into spiritual death just because that was the rule. And the words the Frierdiker Rebbe used were very harsh. He says, rather throw yourself into a fire than to take your children and put them into the scholars, which were the schools and the public schools that were brainwashing children to not believe in anything greater than humanity. No super beings, no creator, but more importantly, that there's nothing else worth living for other than the things that you could decide on your own are important. And then they'll tell you what to decide. So the Frierdiker Rebbe was on a very strong mission. Came Tesvav Sivan, turns out at the time they didn't know this, but there was a tremendous shift in what had happened. And there was a big opening to allow for the local governments to take care of, which is a fancy way of saying to kill, as many or as some or quite a few of the religious leadership in the area, and they would have turned a blind eye from the government levels, from high levels. And amongst the people who were rounded up were many people of different faiths, including from the Muslims, including from the priests, but including also was the Frierdiker Rebbe, who the Bahalosecha, the Jewish brigade of the Communist Party, jumped on the opportunity to be able to take the Frierdiker Rebbe and take him, and instead of having to compile a long, complicated file, which was very hard for them to put together in a level that would be evidence that could be presented in a court, because the Frierdiker Rebbe was very good at what he was doing, it was very hard to pin it down, and they jumped on opportunity to arrest the Frierdiker Rebbe on that day and to take him in to the prison. And the idea was that, like many other of the faith leaders that were arrested that evening, they weren't given a trial, they weren't given interrogations. They were walked into a room that was a firing squad, and as they walked through the door, that was it. And there was no questions asked. So they staged an entire arrest for the Frierdiker Rebbe, and they ransacked the house and interrogated and screaming and shouting, and eventually took the Frierdiker Rebbe away. And Frierdiker Rebbe writes in his memoirs that when he walked into the prison, all the guards and intimidation that was going on, and they told him that he has to walk along the corridor, because when he gets into that corridor, that's where the interrogation will take place. And as he's walking, he realizes that there's nobody walking with him. He's on his own. So why should he rush to get to the interrogation? Let him take his time. So he looked to find a place to rest. Now you've got to imagine the reason why they were comfortable allowing somebody like that to walk on their own, because they were confident in the level of intimidation that they placed in the build-up, in the wee hours of the morning that the arrest had taken place, and including of all the intimidating artifacts and guards and prison sentries that were all around the corridors. They assumed that anybody walking there wouldn't have the audacity, the chutzpah, the brazenness to be able to take a detour. But the Frierdiker Rebbe did. Bashkacha pratis. As he's walking down the corridor, he notices that he's in a very dimly lit corridor, and to the side there's this brightly lit corridor, and he sits himself down and he rolls himself up a cigarette, and he takes his breath, takes his time to recompose himself. And it's there in that corridor that somebody who happened to know the Rebbe's family from Lubavitch walks out and was in a good mood, and eventually tells him where he has to go. And he obviously was playing by the rules and didn't like this idea and whatever, redirected Frierdiker Rebbe. And that was the first step of the miracle. But what's amazing and fascinating is that the Frierdiker Rebbe eventually, at the end of this entire journey, ends off in Yud Beis Tammuz, totally free, and eventually is allowed to leave the country, which was enormous. It was a tremendous nace after nace after nace. But the starting point, which is what we mark this week, is that at the beginning of the story, nobody knew the end of the story. And whilst they were living through it, it looked like the worst disaster. They tell how some of the Hasidim, especially those closest to the Beis Harav, who at the time when the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested, they almost lost their marbles. They were wanting to run to the prison of where the Frierdiker Rebbe was, to turn themselves in and to make up stories so that they should also go down. If the Frierdiker Rebbe is going down, Chas v'Shalom, let them go down with him. That was the mood of some people. Not the one who calmed them down was the Frierdiker Rebbe's mother. But all in all, as we now stand with the advantage of 2020 vision in hindsight, we look back and we see, well, there's more and more coming to light, but we realize that at every twist and at every turn of this story, it was enormous nisim. And what's important for us to realize is that Hashem was with us in the journey. There's one beautiful story I once heard to help us understand when Hashem is making Nisim in Tzaras. And of course, at least the thinking mind, the question is, if Hashem's already making Nisim, why can't he just cancel the hardship if we're already making miracles? So this is a story of somebody who wrote a letter to the Rebbe in which he writes he was very distressed. He was a doctor. And at one point, he decided to do an extra special mitzvah, and he made a Hachnasa Sefer Torah. He wrote a new Torah, and he made a big Hachnasa Sefer Torah, and they had a big celebratory Suda in his house. And amongst the many guests that had come to participate in the celebration was an acquaintance, a Jewish woman who was also a doctor. And while she was at his house, at this tremendous simcha of Hachnasa Sefer Torah, she had an aneurysm, Rahman al-San, and she passed away on the spot in his house at the Hachnasa Sefer Torah. And he, all of a sudden, he didn't know what to put himself. Here he is, making a mitzvah, doing a celebration. He's trying to make it. It was the most joyous moment. And as if Hashem says to him, like, oh, I don't need it. Or I didn't know what to make of it. And he was very, very broken. Extremely. He wrote to the Rebbe, how am I supposed to think about this? And fascinating, the Rebbe sheds light to him in this letter. It's a gorgeous letter in which he explains that number one is, this. I mean, you didn't say this in the letter, but the starting point the Rebbe is going to approach this question and any other question is that we don't understand the ways of Hashem. And the Rebbe mentions this, the famous mashal about the 5-year-old who comes to visit their Zaidi, and she's only 5 years old, but a Zaidi is an old Zaidi, and he's a professor, or he's a researcher, and he's in a lab, and he's doing discoveries, and he's doing science research and the rest. And he tries to explain to the 5-year-old something about what he's doing. And she doesn't get it, but she knows his Zaidi is doing good things. And it makes sense that the 5-year-old doesn't understand the Zaidi's position because the 5-year-old's only 5. And the Zaidi has years and years of experience and knowledge and studying. But what's interesting is that this 5-year-old could possibly, in a few years, actually reach the stage where the Zaidi is up to and understand all of the above. Yet it makes sense that right now she doesn't. Equally, it's important to notice that the Zaidi, who is now the researcher, once upon a time, not that many years earlier, was also only 5 years old and couldn't understand. And yet now, in this difference of time, there's a tremendous gap that the 5-year-old has no clue what's going on and only knows that the Zaidi does know. Says the Rebbe, how much more so we don't understand the ways of Hashem, why things have to happen. So let's just say, says the Rebbe, that we don't understand, but we do know that this person's life was going to end and she was going to pass away on this day. That's how Hashem has decreed it. Why, we don't know, but that is what was going to happen. And now, says the Rebbe to this doctor, imagine to yourself, she was going to pass away on this day anyhow. Why? Because Hashem has willed so for whatever reason Hashem has. Yet at the same time, she could have passed away in the street. She could have passed away in a shop. She could have passed away alone at home. Instead, her final moments of her life were amongst acquaintances, people who cared for her, amongst a mitzvah celebration, and amongst people who were doing things to help her feel the best of the moments of her life. Says the Rebbe to this doctor, just imagine how special it is that you were able to facilitate this. And it goes one step further. The Rebbe writes to him in the footnote of the letter, perhaps the very reason why you had an idea in your mind, something decided that you're going to write a Sefer Torah and you're going to make an entire celebration and you're going to invite all the friends and guests over. Maybe part of the reason why this happened to you, that you had this idea, was in order to facilitate this exact event. Now, this friend of yours, her final moments should be in an environment that would be the best possible setting that would enhance her. So going back to the Yud Beis Tammuz story, we don't know why the Eibishter decided that Yiddishkeit and Chassidism and the Friedrich Rebbe had to go through such hardships. Yet, for whatever reason, the Eibishter decided this was the case. We can see that along the entire path, this very tumultuous path, very challenging path, Hashem was encouraging and helping them out the whole way along, even though they didn't know the end of the story. Like every story, we only know the end after the end. Yet when we look back, we can see and we can notice the nisim that Hashem is going with us step by step, even in the difficult situations that we can't understand, like the 5-year-old who can't understand Zaydi's lab, let alone we don't understand Hashem's lab, but we do see that Hashem is with us. So, what can we take out from Tesvav Sivan? At least one message is, of course, the determination and the commitment of the Friedrich Rebbe, but in a slightly larger scale, zoomed out a little more, we can appreciate that even if, for whatever reason, Hashem has decreed that we'll have to have a challenge, and the Eibush is testing our determination, our commitment, and even then, Hashem isn't forsaking us and watching us from afar. Hashem is coming with us, and He holds us in His hands as we go through step by step with the fullest of confidence, be talking about Hashem, that good things are happening, and that's exactly what happened. Friedrich Rebbe writes often about his ordeal, how many times he encouraged himself that come what may. Come what may means, I don't know what's going to happen next, come what may. I'm going to remind myself over and over that Hashem is in control and that I'm in the hands of Hashem, and I'm not going to let myself frame my reality based on what people or circumstances are telling me. I'm going to frame my reality based on what the Rebbeinu Shalom is telling us in the Torah, that this world is His world, that Hashem is in control. And if we can't see that, let's dig, or let's search. And this is one of the powerful messages that we see of how the Friedrich Rebbe writes. He took the time to put it into our Sefer, in his Sechonis, to be able to help us understand how we can deal with, please God, never anything on that level, but of course the inspiration should always be aspiring towards that way. So this is a little bit of what's going on in the calendar, and from here we're going to jump into a Bahalosecha summary, and then we're going to go and pick up one practical, relevant life message that we'll hopefully learn from this week's Parshah, Parshas Bahalosecha. So let's learn the Parshas Bahalosecha in summary, in a nutshell, without getting carried away first, before we start the Parshah. I think we want to say a shir just on this, but the idea in the Parshas Bahalosecha is one of these Parshas that is multi-layered, in the sense that Bahalosecha, if you read it, looks like one Parsha, but according to some counts of the Torah, Bahalosecha actually spans 3 separate, not just stories, but 3 separate svarim. There's a way to count the Torah that we usually count, Chamisha Torah, that there are 5 svarim. There's one of the counts includes 7 svarim, because Bahalosecha, up until the upside down nuns that we have in this week's Parsha, written in the Torah upside down, is 1 sefer. You have the Vayim Tzoya Arim, which is those psukim in between the 2 upside down nuns in this week's Parsha, is a 2nd sefer of this week's Parsha, which would be equal to sefer 5. And then from the upside down nuns until the end of Bamidbar, which is until the beginning of Devarim, would be yet another sefer, sefer 6, and Devarim would be sefer 7. Sefer Parshas Bahalosecha is a major juncture in Yiddishkeit, in Torah, but historically, in the timeline, chronological order, it's not really in a different time to the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, the whole of Sefer Vayikra, and the bulk of Sefer Shemais. We're still in that first year and a bit period from after Yetzias Mitzrayim until the sojourn in the desert is quickly spent over, and we focus on the last years of the desert. So we're we're still in the same time frame, and let's read what goes on. It's a follow-on from last week's Parsha. In last week's Parsha, we had the Yud Beis Nesiim, the 12 tribal leaders, princes of each tribe, brings the inauguration Karbanis. Big event, tremendous event, in which each one of the Nesiim brought on another day, the first 12 days of the Mishkan, an entire array of Karbanis that were offered up in the Mishkan, and this was just the hello gift, housewarming gift. This was the Chanukas HaMizbeach. And the Chanukas HaMizbeach was a big deal. Obviously, there were karbanos and had to be offered. So who offers up the karbanos? The Kohanim. The Kohanim's job is to offer the karbanos. At this point in time, there are not many Kohanim at all. There's Aaron and his two sons. Because on the very first day, he went down from 4 sons to 2 sons, he lost 2 of his sons. So now you have a staff of 3 Kohanim every day of these 12 days, busy running backwards and forwards to take care of these karbanos. They're going to be Kohanim being born very soon. But in the meantime, you're talking 3 Kohanim. And as Rashi points out, as Aaron is bringing 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 12 days, and the Nesim are bringing, each day another Nasi is bringing a carbon, Al Pi Hashem. Hashem is instructing Moshe to accept the karbanos, and Aaron's feeling forlorn. He's feeling left out. He feels like he's missing out. What about my carbon? Rashi says, this is why we have in the beginning of Parshas Bahalosecha, where Hashem tells Moshe, tell Aaron, this is how you light the menorah. You're going to make sure you have the right oil. And there's a beautiful sikh that also we'll mention in passing, that the Rebbe talks about the menorah had to be achet tehei shall have as oil me'elah. This is in the Shulchan Aruch when it comes to lighting your Shabbos candles, that when you light the candles, sometimes you get candles that you light, put the match to them, and the fire catches the wick, but then it starts flickering out and almost dies, and it kind of catches on just about, and it kind of brings itself back to life. The best way, or the correct way, to light candles, starting off with the Shabbos candle, it starts off way back when, from the times of Aaron would have to light the menorah, until the flame is properly burning on its own. So we keep the match at the wick until the entire wick is properly caught. Nowadays, most candles are good, but you get sometimes candles that don't do that on their own, and therefore it's important to keep an eye out for that. And this is how Aaron lights the candles. And of course, the Sikha teaches us a lesson that if we're going to inspire others, we shouldn't just tell them the ideas so that they know what they're missing out on. We should teach them until they are ready to do it then on their own. And we also share the information until they're inspired to not only do it on their own, but to be able to go on and inspire others. Inspire others to the extent that they are creating a domino effect, and that way the ripples keep rippling. Okay? So we have the mitzvah of telling Aaron how to light the menorah as the opener of Bahalosecha, and that's the word Bahalosecha actually means when you light up the menorah. And then we have how the Shevet Levi, we've had a count of over last week, is actually initiating the service, which included quite an intense program of how each one of the Leviim who are of age between 30 and 50 had to bring up the karbanos. They had to share like a menorah. It was quite intense. And then we have the story of Pesach Sheni. What's the story of Pesach Sheni? Where we have the story where the people who are not able to bring the carbon Pesach, now don't forget, they had one carbon Pesach, which was the night before we left Mitzrayim, the night of Makas B'chayris, when we painted the doorposts, and that was done as a carbon Pesach for what was going to come. We celebrated the redemption that will yet be. But then, the next carbon Pesach was designated to be when they get into Eretz Yisrael. So on the first Pesach anniversary, when the Yiddish people had not yet reached Eretz Yisrael, there should have been no carbon Pesach because they hadn't yet got there. And then all of a sudden, surprise. Out of nowhere, Hashem says, you know what, people? We're going to mark our major anniversary. We're going to mark it with bringing a carbon Pesach outside Eretz Yisrael. We're going to bring a carbon Pesach. Just make it special. We'll do a one-off. And for the vast majority, it was enormous. And for some Yidden who were caught out and had been impure and had not had a chance to be able to go through the 7-day purification process, were caught out. They were not able to bring the Karban Pesach. And they famously came to Moshe Rabbeinu and they asked, Lama Nigara, why are we missing out? Why can't we also bring the Karban Pesach? Moshe says, you know what? Let me ask Hashem. And they achieve to be able to bring a new Yom Tov into the equation. Hashem creates a new creation called Pesach Sheni, which until this very day exists, And in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, became a day where anyone who missed out the first Carbon Pesach is going to bring a second Carbon Pesach based on these Yidden who brought up this tremendous mitzvah. We then have, the Parshah tells us about, besides the Pesach Sheni, how the Yiddish people mobilized and how they traveled as they traveled through the desert. It was very similar to where they encamped and the formation that they had from when they left Sinai. They'd been there almost an entire year, and now they were finally poised to travel. We then have two upside down nuns and the stories of the complaining. And that's how Parshas Bahalosecha has dividers in the middle of the Parsha, because unfortunately, although there's tremendous greatness to be spoken about the Eden, the Torah makes a point to tell us also the times that we messed up, including the time where we were complaining that although we have man, bread, falling from heaven, there's no planting, there's no flour grinding and wheat and what all is, bread falling from heaven. Nevertheless, we're fed up with the bread. Not enough. And we demand that Moshe bring us meat. And that's when the quail birds come and start swooping down in swoops. And then we also have Moshe Rabbeinu has to appoint the Shivim Zkenim, the 70 elders, to help them carry the burden and govern the people who are complainers. In the end of the parasha, we have the story of Miriam, who mentions to her brother Aharon about that Moshe, their brother, who hasn't gone home to live with his wife since he started talking to Hashem, and they kind of made a derogatory remark that what's the big deal? We also talk to Hashem. Hashem, we're also prophets. Why is it that he's refraining from family life? And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the Eibishter descends upon them. And as the cloud lifts, they see that Miriam is punished with tzaras. And with Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron being siblings, it wouldn't be okay for Aaron to go through the process of making Miriam tahir. And Moshe Rabbeinu davens for her to heal. And for 7 days, the entire community waits for Miriam until she becomes better. And the Eibishter only makes us travel after she can join the camp, and that way she doesn't have to travel outside of the clouds as they proceed through the desert. Rashi points out this was part of her reward for having waited for Moshe next to the reeds when Moshe was a little tiny baby in the basket, and she had demonstrated her care to wait for her baby brother, even though it was only a short while. In reciprocation, Midatayv Meruba, the entire community waits for Miriam for a full week while she heals from the terrace after talking about Moshe. That's what's Parshas Bahalosecha. Now, you look at any part of this week's Parsha, it's loaded with messages. Bahalosecha, the very word, Aliyah. And whoever points out that the word Bahalosecha, to light up, rather than Bahaglakosecha, when you light. What's the word up? Bahalosecha. It tells us that that's what we're here for. We're here to uplift people, uplift ourselves. There's loads of messages in every level. Man, the Shivim Zkenim, the healing, the waiting, the transportation, the formation. There's so much to speak about. But I'm going to point out that the Rebbe has a very, very favorite topic. And every opportunity the Rebbe would bring and talk about Pesach Sheni. And perhaps it's quite obvious why now a generation, Pesach Sheni, has become one of these major Yomim Tovim that the Rebbe made a big deal out of, even though Pesach Sheni was barely mentioned. Yes, we didn't say Tachnon. What else do we do? We ate a bit of matzah for Pesach Sheni. Who spoke about Pesach Sheni? The Rebbe makes a massive deal out of Pesach Sheni, over and over again. So when it was Pesach Sheni, we spoke about it. And we're going to speak about it again today in a different angle, with a different maybe message, but the idea of focusing on Pesach Sheni is ever relevant to us. Sometimes we see people who either don't care, or they say, I do care, I'll do harsh judgment upon myself. I'm such a loser. I messed up. This is the same Yetzer Hara in different fancy dress. To say that because I've messed up, therefore am a waste of time, is to measure myself by what I do. And the Rebbe often encourages us to remind ourselves about ourselves and to remind ourselves about the people we interact with. We do not measure people by their choices. If we were a boss and we're looking to hire or fire, you're going to decide based on performance. But that's not how we measure ourselves. We don't measure ourselves based on performance. We measure ourselves based on who we are. What we have done is that whatever that we is has now done this, that, or the other. But the first starting point is who we are. Pesach Sheni reminds us that. Pesach Sheni tells us that I have messed up. And therefore, if I measure by what I've done a mess. Comes along Pesach Sheni and tells us, I am not the mess. I am me, the creation of Hashem, the divine emissary to this universe, to this reality, to this planet, here to make a difference. And the fact that I've messed up, I'm still me. And I have to clean the mess and get up to scratch again. But I shouldn't define myself by the mess. Instead, I should remind myself, as long as I'm still alive, there's always a second chance. And second doesn't mean two. Second means another. There's always another chance. So what we want to start off with is a discussion that talks about, and it's learned, it's maybe, you might call it 2 layers deeper than the regular information. So if you don't mind, what we're going to do is, we're going to assume that we know the idea of Pesach Sheni. We're going to assume we've learned the lesson already. We'll recap it briefly. And then what we're going to do is try and build off that 1 layer deeper and maybe 2 layers deeper if we can. That's what we're headed today. So we want to learn the lesson of Pesach Sheni, but we don't want to just repeat what we've learned already. We want to take that and go one step deeper, 1 step further, and bring that step home to our personal life. That's where we're going today. So we're going to do with the introduction. And the introduction is going to be that Chai, life, is something that Hashem creates. We don't make life. We are partners in making life, but life comes from Hashem. So if life, when we say Chai is alive, life is defined by what the Eibusher decides is life. So the Rebbe would often talk about one of the signs of something being alive is that it grows. Growth, improvement. And as long as we're alive, we're constantly looking to do more good things, become better. Whether it's better health, whether it's better wealth, better purpose, all of the above, something else purposeful. But this is the idea that life is defined by being able to grow and upgrade our reality. So let's just say, imagine, you have somebody who's doing every mitzvah. They're getting it all right. Maybe they were brought up this way. Maybe they made their own journey into doing the right thing. They're getting it all right. So if they're living everything according to the Shulchan Aruch and they're doing the right thing, so where's life? Where's the upgrade? Where's the advancement? And in this, many times over, we hear over and over again, Chassidus makes a big deal out of this, the answer is that we upgrade what we're doing. Let's just say, as we grow older, we have more talent. So the upgrade would be not just to do all the mitzvahs, the do's and the don'ts, but to do them better. Using and going back to the life experiences, maybe the appreciations that I've developed, the acquaintances and the circles of influence I have. It might not necessarily have been that I missed out until now. It's not like a mistake or a problem in my past, but upgrade. That's what life is. Life is to constantly look to up our game, to make it even better. Now, this is where we have to start realizing that when we talk about upping our game, then the Yetzer Hara has a field day in smoke screening and making it look like we're being righteous, but sometimes it's exactly the opposite. let's just say when it comes to the Shulchan Aruch, it's more black and white. Should I keep Shabbos or should I not keep Shabbos? Well, that's black and white. Either it's the right thing to do or it's the wrong thing to do. Should I eat something that's unkosher? Well, it's very clear. The Torah will tell us whether I should or shouldn't. So that's like the easy part relative or compared to the stuff that we talk about upgrading, upping our game. Let's just say, by way of example, I have an option, I have a choice to whether I'm going to spend my time. I've done all my davening, I've done my mitzvahs. Am I going to spend time reading a book, relaxing, or am I going to spend time doing laundry right now? Or, I don't know, calling a friend. So you check the Shulchan Aruch is not going to tell you what to do. You check the rabbi, what's the rabbi going to tell you? You do whatever you want. It's all kosher. Upping my game now means that I've got to think which of these three things are more in line with what Hashem wants from me. This is where the Yetzer Hara is a field day in smokescreen and making it look like this is brilliant. Oh, it's very righteous to do this, or it's very righteous to do the other. And it might be. And so maybe it's the right thing. But trying to find barometers, measures that will help us understand and appreciate what growth means when we're looking past the do's and the don'ts of the basic halacha, this is where sometimes we need to have direction. And Chassidus will go back to the same answer all the way through. And Chassidus is going to tell us if we're doing what we're doing because Hashem wants us to do so, and every choice that I make in my life is focused this way, then it's going to be much easier to make those choices when I don't have necessarily a guidebook that tells me, do this, don't do that. How does that work? So let's look inside into this week's Parshah, an interesting observation that the Sicha makes. And the Sicha makes this observation. The Sicha makes this observation that will help us appreciate this fascinating lesson. This is from this week's Parshah that talks about as we said, it's not the beginning of the Parshah, but it's the story of Pesach Sheni. Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert in the first month of the second year of the Exodus from Egypt, saying, children of Israel should bring the Pesach offering in its appointed time. My girls just had this in a test, on a Rashi test, and the question was, what is the date that this pasuk just described? It wasn't this pasuk, it was different pasuk, similar pasuk, we'll get that soon. But what is the date of this first month of the second year? Think about it. The second year makes it sound like it's been 2 years already, but it hasn't. The first month of the second year is 13 months. And actually, the way it's really supposed to be read is actually not even 13 months, it's 12 and a half months. Because Pesach, when they left Egypt, was middle of the month of Nisan. And now we're talking about the first month is the beginning of Nisan. But it's the second year already because it's the second time again to Nisan. So it's just under 12 months later. They've just about left Egypt. They're about to come to their first anniversary. And here we're talking about, and the first anniversary, it's 15 days before Pesach, where most Jewish homes will be Pesach cleaning, but they weren't doing Pesach cleaning because as far as they're aware, they're not bringing carbon Pesach, as we said, until they get to Eretz Yisrael. And then all of a sudden, surprise, announcement, although we're not in Eretz Yisrael, we're still in Har Sinai, we're going to have a carbon Pesach. And this is exciting stuff. The announcement's made, and the Yiddish people gathered together. They're going to have a carbon Pesach. So, also continues that whilst they're there, the children of Israel brought the Pesach offering in Sinai Desert in the afternoon on the 14th day of the month, and they did it in accordance with all that Hashem instructed Moshe. Every detail was done exact. Amazing. Rashi points out, what do they mean they did everything they said? This was said in praise of the Israelites. They precisely had Moshe instructed, and they didn't miss out a single detail. Here comes another, this is the pasuk that we're looking for. This is what happens on pasuk Vav. So Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Daled, Hey describe carbon Pesach. Pasuk Vav calls our famous Pesach Sheni story, as we said, we've read many a time. We're going to go through this quickly. Several men were in a state of ritual contamination by virtue of contact with a dead body, and were thus unable to bring the Paschal offering on that day. They approached Moshe and Aaron on the day. They said to them, we are impure by virtue of contact with the dead body. Why should we lose out and be unable to bring the offering to Hashem amongst the children of Israel at the point in time? What does this mean to lose out? Why can't we be part of mitzvahs? Why should we not have a chance to do this mitzvah? Now, you've got to imagine that this was considered quite a big deal for them to come to Moshe Rabbeinu and say, we want to do a mitzvah. We missed out. This is the famous quote, make-up dates for sacrifices are virtually unheard of. It's like missing your anniversary. If you snooze, you lose. And the very request, let alone demand, is audacious and unheard of. It once again demonstrates just how intensely they desire to do this mitzvah. They went against all the rules, that if you miss them, the opportunity, it's over. They came to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, Moshe, we still want to do it even though we've missed out. Please, try and make a miracle that we should be able to somehow go back in time and have a second chance. And it worked. And this is what we know about Pesach Sheni. And of course, the message that we said already, Pesach Sheni message. Don't judge ourselves by what we have done or not done. We are who we are, and therefore we should do what we should do. So that's the general Pesach Sheni message. We're now going to dig deeper. We're going to get into the next layer. Now that we know the story and how it's learned from the Parshah and how it plays itself out, let's look at the way Rashi points out something else in this Parshah by contrasting it with the opening psukim of Parshas Bamidbar that was 2 parshas ago. We read it 3 weeks ago. What's the opening psukim? This is the beginning of the Sefer of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar. On the first day of the second month of the second year after the exodus from Egypt, Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert in the tent of meeting, saying, this is the first day, not of the first month, the first day of the second month of the second year. So this is a month after the story of being the announcement of the Yiddish people are going to bring a carbon Pesach. This is 2 weeks after Pesach. This is between the Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. And what happens then? Hashem gives the command that we read then, count the congregation of the children of Israel by families following their father's house, a head count of every male according to the number of their names. There was a census taken 2 weeks after Pesach, which happened to be 2 weeks before Pesach Sheni. This is the opening of the book of Bamidbar, and Rashi is going to describe or discuss which of these two dated stories, the one which we just read here of the census, which is dated the beginning of the month of Iyar, second month of that second year, which happens to be the opener of this book, the fourth book of the Torah, and we're comparing it to the story in our Parshah that took place in the first month of that second year, in the month of Nisan. The story in our Parashah is the story of the Karban Pesach and the Pesach Sheni. Both are stories that have dates on them, and the Torah describes the story, each one in detail, including the date that it took place. And the Rashi is going to point out which one of these two are more fitting to be the opener of the entire book. There's a rule, Ein muktam u'mu'ochar b'Torah. The Torah doesn't just randomly mess with the natural timelines unless there's a compelling reason to do so. So if you have a story in the Torah, generally we assume it's in chronological order. The Ramban says this as a rule, point blank. He says this is very serious. The entire Torah is in chronological order except for those occasions when the Torah specifies that the dates are out of order. And even in those cases, it is for good reason and proper purpose. If you're going to write a book, you're going to write it in order. You don't write a book backwards. You write the book in order. This is the Ramban, his position. Interestingly, according to the Ramban, we've got a major question. What's the major question? The opening story takes place in the second month. and the story 2 parshas later in our parsha actually takes place a month earlier, it's way out of whack. It's out of order. We wait 2.5 parshas to get to the story that took place a month earlier. It seems like we're backwards. So the Ramban seriously got a question here. Why are the stories not in the right order? Shouldn't our story, the story of Parshah and Pesach, be at the beginning, and the census that took place later be later? Question number 1, Ramban. But even Rashi, who interestingly enough argues with the Ramban at times, it's fascinating. Just Agav, his argument is, if the Torah was a book of history, then that's a fair observation. But the Torah isn't a storybook. You want to read stories, I'll go and read the Torah. That's not the design of the Torah. There's great stories in the Torah. Tremendously drama-filled stories. Loads of them. And they're brilliant. That's not the Torah. The Torah isn't a storybook. The Torah isn't a book of fairy tales, chas v'shalom, or even true stories. The Torah is a book of a way of life. And therefore there's no reason, says Rashi, for the Torah to have to write anything in order. Generally, the lessons that we learn are more or less in chronological order. But there's no reason for the Torah to have to specify in the right order. Ein seder muktam u'mocha b'Torah. The order of events in Torah is not chronological, says Rashi. In this case, even though generally it doesn't have to be this way, in this case, in our parsha, note the Rashi's the source text that we have on the screen here is from this week's parsha. And as the Mefarshim explain, what Rashi is saying is, although generally speaking, the Torah doesn't have to write things in order, in our instance, there's a very specific reason why the Torah chooses to not put it in the right order. And there must be a reason in our instance, because actually, if we were deciding which one should come first, the census story or the Korban Pesach story, there's good reason to do it the other way around, to put the Pesach story first. And here the Rebbe elaborates. Oh, great picture. This is a Torah with a heart. What's the picture about? So the Rebbe points out in the Sikha that the Torah makes a huge effort that the opening story or topic of each of the 5 books of the Torah should start off by showcasing Hashem's love for the Yiddish people. It should be clear in the opening lines that each parasha, each book of the Torah starts off with an appreciation and a demonstration of love between Hashem and us. In the Sefer Bereshis, it starts off with Hashem tells us about his creation of heaven and earth, which explains why do we need to have the history of creation? In order that people know that Jews have a right to the land of Eretz Yisrael. That's why the entire book of the story of creation was included out of pure love for the Jewish people, that people should know that they have a right to the land. How does that work? Because although people might argue that we stole the land, Hashem decided he's giving to us, and he has the right to give it to us because Bereshis bara Elokim. He is the creator. How do I know? The opening verses of the Torah describe how Hashem is the creator and therefore has the right to give us the land. There you have it. In the very first book, second book of the Torah, book of Shemos, describes Hashem counting out the names of all the 12 tribes that came down to Mitzrayim. And Rashi says, we just had this list of names the week before, in the parasha before. Says Rashi, no, it's being listed again to demonstrate chibason, his love for the people. He lists them out name by name. This third book, the book of Vayikra, full of laws of karbanis, very technical. The opening word is Vayikra, Hashem, El Moshe. Hashem calls out to Moshe. And then Rashi says, what's this calling out? Hashem speaks to Moshe so many times throughout the Torah. Why all of a sudden we have the word and Hashem calls to Moshe and talks to him? He probably called him every time. No. Starting a new book, we're going to demonstrate that Hashem doesn't just mention in passing matters for the Yiddish people. In love for his people, he calls them in love. This week's Parshah, this Sefer, this Midbar that we're talking about here, we'll get to in a minute. And of course, Sefer Devarim, we also have where Hashem is going to conceal any rebuke, any punishments that were alluded to in the opening lines of Devarim, of Moshe Rabbeinu's talk to the Yiddish people, were all written, coded, so that it should be clear that although, unfortunately, we had mess-ups, those were underneath. In the open, it's all got Dizahav, and there's gold, and there's great places. They're code names for major mess-ups. But on the open, as you read the Parashah, it's clear that Hashem, out of appreciation for us, chooses to focus only on positivity when it comes to us. Okay, let's just see this inside. Rashi says, this is from Bereshis. Why does the Torah talk of Bereshis? Should the nations ever accuse the Jews of stealing Israel, the land of the 7 nations? The Jews will respond, the whole world belongs to Hashem. He created it and gave it to the people he chose. It was his choice to give it to them, and it's also his choice to take it from them and give it to us. And that is demonstrated by the way the first Sefer starts. Equally, when you have in our book, says Rashi, our book of Midbar starts off with a head count, a census, because it demonstrates the love that Hashem has for us. God counts the Jews all the time because he loves them. When we left Mitzrayim, he counted us. After the golden calf, he counted us. And again, by the Mishkan, he counts us. Hashem counts us whenever he wants to demonstrate his love. And that's the opening act when it comes to this week's this Sefer of Midbar. However, we're going to read this inside. I think we're racing the Chicago. But let's leave it on the screen. I'm going to read it soon. We'll say what it says. Here's the question, the way it's posed against Rashi, is that the story of the census demonstrates the love Hashem has for the people. But the story of Pesach Sheni is a way better story that would demonstrate the love between the Yidden and Hashem. Think about it. The Jewish people so were excited to be able to do Karban Pesach. Hashem gave them a gift out of nowhere. They were only supposed to do this Pesach offering in Eretz Yisrael, and here Hashem dumps them in, throws them a gift and says, here, have one. Do a mitzvah, do the Karban Pesach today. And the Yidden people lap it up, and they're so excited by this demonstration of love, they turn around and those who missed out say, we also want to have another chance. And guess what? They get a second chance. That's unbelievable demonstration of Hashem giving them the mitzvah, extending the mitzvah for those who missed out as well. Isn't that the most loving story of how we feed off each other? Wouldn't that be the best way to start the book? So why do we go out of chronological order and take a lesser story to demonstrate Hashem's love for us and then choose the lesser story instead of the better one? And this, Rashi has to say, we have to answer that. And there's a reason why the Parashah was chosen this way. The answer is going to be, although it's a brilliant story to demonstrate how much Hashem loves us and how we insisted on trying to get a second chance, and Hashem gave us that as well. But Rashi's going to tell us the price tag on that story is the implicit message. Sometimes we would like to say how gorgeous or how beautiful, how brilliant, how loving somebody is. And the more we go on, the more questions it raises about the implicit messaging that's coming up. Oh, it was so fantastic that day. You did so many good things. What happened every other day? Where were you all the other time? If it was so wonderful, how come it was a one-off? Says Rashi, this is why the Torah chooses not to use this extremely loving story of how the Yiddish people were given such a gift of a carbon, and were given even an extension to that, to those who missed out, got a second chance. Because if that was the highlight, the question would be, what about everything else? Says this in the words of Rashi. Why did the Torah not begin with a Karban Pesach for the Sefer of Midbar? Because it is a disgrace to the Jews that throughout the 40 years of their sojourn in the desert, only one, they only brought this one Pesach offering. The 39 other years, they didn't bring a Karban Pesach. It was a one-off. And therefore, although it's a tremendously highlighting story, but it raises too many questions or raises implicit questions that would be derogatory to the love of between Hashem and Yidden, and therefore chooses not to. Interesting. So here we have the Korban Pesach, that was a tremendous gift to these people that we've spoken about. We then also said that Rashi uses this to tell us, although it was a tremendous, uplifting, good story, it has in it an implicit message that seems to imply that although Yidden were good that year, we're not going to highlight it because it's going to raise questions about what happened all the following years. And what happens next, what we're going to do now is level 3, where the Rebbe takes this in the Sikh. We're going to do it outside because we're against the clock, and just brings out such a beautiful, workable measure that allows us to be able to grow our own personal growth. And even when there's not clarity about what's considered growth, what's the right thing to do, it helps us have a measuring stick of where we want to go. The short of it's going to be that sometimes we could grow and leave everyone else behind because we're grown. Now, we're not talking about doing the Torah Shulchan Aruch. As we said, the Shulchan Aruch is black and white, it's easy. But we're talking about sometimes where we want to do something extra. And we're not sure whether extra means to do less of this or more of this. Should I be more available for my kids? Or should I go and daven more on my own? Should I go and spend time doing something for the community? Or should I study or become a better self, which is considered more righteous? I'm going beyond the letter of law. I have the freedom to do. I've done all my boxes. I've checked everything off. Where should I go next? Should I put myself aside for the sake of community? Or for the sake of the majority, everyone else? Or should I put everyone else aside and say, hold on a second, I've done my bit. Now let me focus on myself. Here is the fascinating message. The Rebbe tells us we learn from this story, from this Rashi that's on the screen now. By raising the question, we understand that the Jewish people, for whatever reason, weren't on the level that the year after and the year after that, we're in a position to ask Hashem for a second chance, or for a chance to do the Korban Pesach, which is gnus. It's a little bit of a disgrace that after being shown and demonstrated such love and care from Hashem, we didn't think of trying to do the Korban Pesach the next year or the year after, or the year after that, or the year after that for 39 years until we got into Eretz Yisrael. However, where's it gone? Jewish leaders are primarily and completely invested in thinking about the people and doing things for the people. Moshe even risked his life for the Jewish people. He didn't really risk his bodily life. He also risked his spiritual life. He said to Hashem, if you don't forgive the Jewish people, count me out, erase me the entire book. Therefore, the question becomes, Moshe Rabbeinu, if you are the leader, you are leading the people, why didn't you ask Hashem for the Korban Pesach and instead leave it in the status quo? Because the Jewish people haven't asked, you're not going to ask. Why didn't Moshe or Aaron, who are obviously righteous, why didn't they step up the game? And here was the answer. Moshe Rabbeinu knew how much Allah Hashem loved the fact that the Jewish people had gone out of the way to ask for a mitzvah. Moshe Rabbeinu knew how precious it would be to Hashem if the Jewish people on year number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or any other year would do the same thing. Yet, they also knew that if the Jews weren't ready to ask and they were to ask instead, that wouldn't be growth for the Yiddish people. That would be their growth. And it would actually come at the expense of the people. In which way? If Moshe Rabbeinu goes to Hashem and says, Hashem, let's have another Korban Pesach this year, that would highlight that the followership are slacking, and only Moshe, the leader, is growing. And that would be a subtle form of downplaying of talking down about the masses. And therefore Moshe says, hold on one second. Instead of me trying to arrange a carbon Pesach on my own, if the Jews aren't doing it themselves, I'm not going to do it instead of them, even though that would be growth for me. But that would come at the cost of, my upgrade would come at the cost of downgrading or downplaying the people. Instead, I'm going to lead the people in helping them build up where they are up to. Because at the end of the day, my personal growth beyond the letter of the law is being able to help others grow wherever they are up to. And therefore, if it's a choice between upgrading my own at the cost of others versus helping others grow, and together we'll grow at a low, slower pace, but we'll grow together, that becomes the choice on the Torah level. And this is how Moshe Rabbeinu demonstrates it. He doesn't ask for a carbon Pesach on year 2, 3, or 4. Instead, he helps the Yidden on the level that they are up to, because that's how we define growth, upgrading. We called it life before. What is life? Life is when we're able not only to achieve or to accumulate or to have more of our own victories, but life is when we upgrade Hashem's plan. If we're focused on what we were born to do, which is to make this world a better place for Hashem. Personal growth is great. It's very important, as long as it doesn't come at the account of others. If I'm in a leadership position, if I have others who are relying on me for direction, then I've got to make sure that the growth I'm taking brings them with, doesn't leave them behind. And when I can do that, this is a message, a level 2 Pesach Sheni message. Level 1 Pesach Sheni message is there's never too late. And level 2 is going to be that even when I'm struggling to be able to grow on my own because it's going to come at the cost of others, lean in, get involved, because by helping others, that's the ultimate true growth. Even if it means that this story is going to be put out of sync. Or as Rashi says, this is the message of this week's Parshah coming out of chronological order. It's teaching us that there's a subtle little idea that tells me that even when I could do better for myself, but if it's at the cost of others, put myself on hold, push others. Now, I'm just going to mention one more time, that's providing, we're not talking about the black and white Shulchan Aruch, which tells us clearly what to do, but as a barometer of what's considered growth outside of, beyond the do's and the don'ts, the blacks and the whites, the answer has to be making the world a better place. Using my circle of influence is the most surefire way that I'm doing the right thing rather than pursuing my own personal growth. We learned something. It's Pesach Sheni message that we've done many a time, but level 2. And as we said, we also have the message of yesterday, test of Sivan, in which even when things are challenging, we've got to remind ourselves that Hashem is with us every step of the way, carrying us. Thank you very much for joining. Wishing everybody a wonderful week. And Be'ez Hashem, looking forward to seeing you again next week. Seid gesund.